If there's any of you that are sitting in the back or standing in the back that would like to fill up these seats right here. Oh God, I didn't even think of that. All of you that say, "Oh, I got a free poster." Nah, too late, too late. Welcome to the final lecture in the SCI-Arc Fall Lecture Series. It started off, I think, with the remarkable work of a remarkable firm in Vienna, Coop Himmelblau, and it ends with the remarkable work of a remarkable architect from Princeton, New Jersey, Michael Graves. The series, I think, has been an extraordinary success. Due to the efforts of a few students, Cynthia Carlson, Janet Simon, and Jennifer Rakow, with the guidance of Robert Mangurian. I think that, they should be commended for the effort that they put in. For those of you that are new to the lecture series of SCI-Arc, there will also be this year a spring lecture series, which begins, I believe, the end of January. The significance of an architect's work, I believe, can be measured by the good it does for the disciplines and the intensity of the debate that surrounds it. Its importance, I think, is then measured by the quality of the debate that his ideas continue to generate. Michael Graves' work has stimulated, as many of you know, quite a lot of debate in the past and has continued to be very controversial. He was born in Indianapolis, and from some of the readings that I've been doing the last few days, trying to find out more about his personal life, his childhood. He seems to have led a rather normal life as a child, with I think a slight exception. It's always interesting to find out what sort of brought somebody to their profession, and perhaps something this quote might, to some extent, answer that, and he can certainly rebut it when he gets up here. Michael's quote: "I did so poorly at playing the violin that it was finally taken away from me. The screech was too great for the house. Wanting to excel at something, I began to draw." He's continued to draw and draw and draw, and to I think all of our benefit, he began to build and build quite a bit, which I believe is the real test of an architect's ideas. His ideas, I believe, also have held up exceptionally well. The body of his work, which continues to grow, has consistently applied the same high standard in its thought and production. I think that this fact, along with what I think is immense strength of character that sustains such a public figure, has served him well, but I believe more importantly has served all of us very well. I give you Michael Graves.
Thank you, Michael. It's nice to be here. It's not like our school at all. But I'll trade any of you for this one. I see old friends and former students and now practicing architects that have some reputation in the audience, friends of mine. And so it gives me kind of pause giving a talk like this, because I always feel that those people have all heard it before and they should go home. And because the work doesn't seem to change very much. And the first part of this talk doesn't seem to change at all. And I don't know why that is. I've never found a better one, I guess. It varies a little bit, but not very much. I thought about this talk a bit because I knew I would feel a little bit odd tonight being here, and especially because Tom and Michael make me feel very old-fashioned. I went to their office before coming here, and then we had dinner at 72 Market Street, and I'm really from another time. And then they told me a story that made me feel better. Their client, evidently for 72 Market Street, said he wanted a turn-of-the-century restaurant, and they gave it to him. And actually, that should have been my client, and I would have given it to him too. But they probably would have been different places. But the letters I got for tonight's talk, which started about 3 years ago, I think, there have been a lot of them. And I didn't realize how many letters had been written by the lecture committee with lots of members signing them. Said that this series had to do in part with eclecticism. They didn't put it quite that way, but I have a way of misreading. So that's, I think, what you're going to, you're not going to get an eclectic talk tonight, but given the other people that you've had and what I think this place stands for and a lot of young architects in LA stand for is so much different than my work that I think some of you will have a very hard time with this. But to prepare you for what you're going to see, I think we'll do a little Architecture 101 first. So if we could have the first two slides, please. Okay. And maybe we don't need these lights. And I certainly don't need this light. These are two sitting rooms. These two rooms were built exactly 100 years apart. That's just fortuitous. It sounds good. They actually were. The one on the right you all know, I think. The one on the left you probably don't know. The one on the left is a Biedermeier painting done in the first quarter of the 19th century by a painter by the name of Georg Friedrich Kersting. And he has painted what I find to be a quite wonderful little room with a figure sitting on a Biedermeier chair at her work, her needlepoint, I take it. And the casement windows are open, and she can see the garden when she looks up, and certainly the light of the garden illuminates her work and looks back into the room. The room is simple, it appears, but if you start to look at the kind of domestic setting that is not altogether nostalgic and sweet, but certainly for me memorable in that the simplicity of the room and the simplicity of the gestures, even the garland around the family portrait, probably of a recently deceased member. The green wall, presumably identifying the garden as it is reread in the room and not literally brought in by making a ficus tree in the room. And then finally, the portrait of the figure as seen in the mirror on the right-hand side, as you see that kind of wonderful German face, kind of pudgy cheeks and all of that. There is a certain kind of, I suppose, contentment in her expression. But I don't know how you all would feel, but I wouldn't mind having my drafting table at that window. I wouldn't, well, there's my violin. Michael. And the story is true. But just as parenthetically to that story, I once had an interview with Ada Louise Huxtable a number of years ago, and she said to me, I've been told by a number of people that I have neglected you and I should write something about you, and you're having this show of your drawings. And before we start, I just want to make something clear about your upbringing as a painter. And I said, no, my upbringing was as an architect. And she said, no, you were trained as a painter. I've been told you were trained as a painter. You drew a lot, and then you started to take painting classes, and you went to art school. And I said, no, I didn't actually. I never went to art school, except one day on a Saturday afternoon when I was 9, I went to John Herron Art Institute in Indianapolis and drew a plaster tiger, and enjoyed it thoroughly, but didn't go back for some reason. And she said, that's not the way I heard it. And I said, were you there? And you know, if you've ever seen her, talked to her, you know, it's a bit frightening because she wears, like some of my friends today, wear only black, and she's a very serious woman. And I said, no, it isn't true. I didn't go to art school, just that one Saturday afternoon. And the next Sunday in the newspaper it said, Michael Graves trained as a painter. So the story actually is not true about the violin. I was trained as a painter. I wasn't very good at it. And I switched to architecture because I was so good at physics and chemistry and structures and all these other things you have to do. The picture on the right is also a sitting room, and of course it's at Poissy, and Le Corbusier built this room in the first quarter of the 20th century. And if we look to the left of his room, we see the roof terrace, his so-called toit jardin, and we see, of course, where we might locate the furniture in that room around that wonderful hearth. Now, clearly, these two rooms intend to do two different things, and they are both about living, they're both about a place to be, they are both domestic settings, but they are dramatically different in character. The one on the left, and let's just look at the windows for a moment, the one on the left has what I would call a real window, in that when you need to get the breezes, you throw open the sash, and therein lies this wonderful physical action related to the opening to the garden. The one on the right is a literal translation of the garden. And I'm certainly not trying to dump on Le Corbusier tonight, because it's only because he was such a great architect that one can use an example like this to describe the differences between one thing and the other. But Le Corbusier had an idea about the structure of this building that would support the floors and the ceilings, that would be independent of the glass, of course, called the maison domino, and he was able, therefore, to make a glass wall. And therefore, the continuous ground plane between the roof terrace and his sitting room was only interrupted by the glass, and one understands as well that if it were a different climate and the glass could disappear, that he would probably have preferred that. But I find that the literal attitude toward the landscape, toward us in the landscape, on one hand, and the symbolic identification with our presence in the landscape and its light and so on, as we see in the Kersting painting, the dramatic difference between one kind of architecture and another. I said something about the hearth, or that fireplace with its fire brick on the outside. You all know that it goes on the inside, but here Le Corbusier is exposing the fire brick, and given that he was a pretty bright guy, we know that he was saying something, and saying something very different at the same time that Frank Lloyd Wright was saying hearth. Le Corbusier was saying, I've got this object, fireplace here. Probably the clients have asked for it, but I'm going to make this thing in an almost unappealing way, because I'm suggesting to you, by making this symbol in the room, that it's not a place for gathering. That's not what this room is about, this space is about. One is a room, one is a space, I suppose you can say. This is a kind of machine in the room with its innards hanging out, and therefore it's not for 20th century man. We can do without it. Thank you very much. If you take this room further and think, or the space further, and think about the location of chairs in it, if you think about the location of, for instance, that long light in the ceiling, and how you would divide the room by virtue of that light, you understand that Le Corbusier's interest is not so much about making the domestic setting in the room, but in fact escaping the room and getting to the roof terrace or getting to the landscape beyond. And again, in a literal way, to walk through the wall, to walk through that window wall. Next, please. Oh, do I do that? I can't see. I'm so old. You didn't like those two? You like these better? Okay. Let's do these two rooms. The room on the left is a room as well you may not know, and I would say quickly, if you were from Princeton, you wouldn't know it either. It's a Hotel de Burbank. It's clearly after the work of Robert Adam. It's in Paris, this one, so it's a later take. And Adam's work is in turn a take on the Etruscans and the Pompeian wall painting. And on the right-hand side, we have the kind of the real thing, a third style wall painting, probably around the year 70, and the one on the left about 100 years ago. Now, it's a curious juxtaposition in a way. The room on the left is, for me, clearly a room. It's a bedroom. It's a bedroom made of a series of elements that describe not only the privacy, but also something beyond the enclosure of the room. Now, having just come from the villa at Poissy, Villa Savoye at Poissy of Le Corbusier, we are seeing something else here, but I want you to, as you look at pictures like this, to think of the moment before, and think about that big open glass wall, which you have, I think, lots of here in California, and for very good reason, I take it. But here, in a bedroom meant to be private, it doesn't work so well, and especially in an urban setting. So what the architect has done is to paint the walls as if they were made of parchment. And the parchment is meant to be kind of first century glass, and that's the reason I show you the little dining room wall on the right, because those walls as well, because they were impacted by other rooms as they were sort of cheek to jowl with other similar rooms, and there was very little light, the light was painted on, or the sense of light was painted on, and there was an interpretation of light, not the real thing. Clearly not that the real thing would be bad, because I suspect if you move that blue drape behind the bed, you would have a window. But given the privacy of the bedroom, the drape has been closed, the walls become, for me at least, luminous, and we are not denied the idea of light. And if you look further at the kind of armature, if this works, I'll show you. If you see the armature here of what was at one time bronze metalwork in the 1st century, and then seen again by people like Percier and Fontaine in the 18th century, we see the idea of 1st century enclosure or glass, where the paper would be the glass, the armature would be the mullion, and you look further and you see the painting on the wall representing these curious figures painted much too small for the quadrato or the rectangle that we find them in. It was a way of painting perspective without understanding perspective. By making the figures small, it was thought that they could be cast out into the garden. So in those transepts, we see the distance by virtue of the smallness of the figure. Well, once that's explained to you, though you might not notice it at the beginning, it's not foreign to us to understand those kinds of attitudes, to the interest of maintaining the privacy in a room like that and still have a luminous wall. On the right-hand side, very quickly, one sees through the opening in the wall, the kind of frame or window painted on the wall, again, a figure in the landscape outside. This is some sort of totemic device with garden elements around it, as you see the kind of plant life around it. Again, cast into the distance, not real perspective, obviously, but into this kind of frontalized idea of the garden beyond. But the reason I show you this picture is because of this curious little thespian here in that transit, as he looks back, as a theatrical figure, looks back into what is surely a dining room, we've been told, just in our foreground here. And I ask you just to look for a moment at his position relative to the room and to the garden outside, because he is in this kind of netherland of neither in the room nor outside the room in the garden. He stands in the depth of the wall, and in a way, he brings a kind of consciousness to the idea that he's neither one place or the other. And one thinks about literature at that point, or I do. My curious mind jumps in places such as thinking about in Chaucer, the miller, as he escapes the text, as he thinks we may not know what's being said, and he has to, Chaucer has to cast one of his characters outside the text and speak to us privately. And so he says things like, oh, by the way, if you're not getting this joke, it means this and this and this, and perhaps you weren't around when that was really current, but this is how it's being used in the play, and I hope you get it now. Shakespeare, of course, does the same thing. And here, this figure is almost like a voyeur, standing in the depth of the terracotta wall, looking back at the action of the dining room, and in a way, participating both in this interior and exterior simultaneously by the imagination of the text that might be described by such action. As architects, I suppose one of the most abstract things that we do is to make the plan. Now, I say that with some trepidation because here in Los Angeles, plans currently are being turned up in the vertical dimension, and that's what makes me feel so old-fashioned. But nevertheless, here, in a comparison of a 16th century plan and a 20th century plan, I ask you to not necessarily suspend your disbelief, but simply look at the differences between the two in terms of a figurative attitude toward plan making and an abstract attitude toward plan making. There are no heroes and there are no villains in this, but there are certainly different ball games, different rules being played here. If you were the Pope and you had Raphael and other people build you a villa on the hills north of Rome, to someplace for you to be cool on a hot July or August afternoon, you would have built something like this on the left, called the Villa Madama. This building was to be about 5 or 6 times larger than this, but stopped because of the sack of Rome in 1527. And this is the amount that was built. But this was clearly the first thing that the Pope wanted to be built, and it's nothing more than a big porch. And here's the porch here, this 3-part organization there confronting the garden. But if we were invited to tea some July afternoon, we would arrive in our carriage here, clearly in these kind of the embracement of these two arms. We would enter the front door at that point. We would walk through a vestibule. It's a little deceiving. That's quite large in here. All of that was decorated by the school of Raphael. And then into this one big room divided into 3 parts, which looked out to the garden. That simply had Le Corbusier's drape across that front face, no glass, no screen wire. Today it has rather dreadful glass across it. If we wanted to stay overnight, we took a kind of secret passage back in here. We found a bedroom by Giulio Romano, not bad, and some guest rooms over here. And a view of Rome back down that way. We parked our horses down a level below. If we wanted to be really cool, stay cool, we would go to the Nymphaeum or the grotto just beyond. It was said that the Pope liked to play pinochle in the nude in the garden, which brings it all back home, I suppose. But for me, the hierarchical sense of the plan is clarified clearly by the proportions of the gestures, the walls, the thicknesses, the frontality, that, as the French call it, the architectural marche, as one is moving through the plan. And not that it's just open and revealed to you. There are obviously secrets and differences in this plan and things to be discovered, but most of it has to do with the symbolic interests of the walls and the surfaces around the walls as they contribute to the understanding of that hierarchy. Now, I won't be so tedious with my work. I'll just kind of go through it quickly, but I do want to do this tonight. So give me a few more minutes with this. On the right-hand side, Le Corbusier's unbuilt so-called brick villa. And I think the date is like 35. And you see the walls as they stretch out into the plans, and I suppose if Mies could have built the walls, did I say Mies before? Built the walls into the garden further, he would have. There is a kind of pinwheeling of the whole plan. Let's do our routine of going to tea or lunch at the Brick Country Villa now. And your Mercedes has parked somewhere outside, and you are, as I always am, late, hurrying to the front door. You have found it by now, have you not? No. Well, there's a bit of a problem with that, obviously, because one of the interests of people like Mies van der Rohe is, of course, in the literal translation of the room to the landscape, with the wall, the glass wall that separates the room here and the landscape there, and the perspectival wall. Now, it's not frontal the way it was in that Pompeian example. It's now descending into the garden and making the garden seem much, much larger by virtue of its parallel attitude toward our gaze, we have given up the frontality or the sense of entry and hierarchy that a more traditional house such as the Villa Madama would have. Well, if you haven't found the drive or the front door or the sign to it, you've at least found the fireplace by now, because that's that big lump with the notch taken out of it here. And if that, therefore, is the living room, you can easily find the dining room and the kitchen and the master bedroom, the guest bedroom where you might stay over if the tea is really good, the can, and so on. Well, actually, you haven't. You have found larger and smaller spaces, but you haven't found the hierarchy that's evident in a rather simple plan like the Villa Madama. And I find then my difficulty with a thing like that is that even though abstractly it's quite glorious, and I taught a course at Princeton that I think maybe Stefanos might have taken early on called Spots and Dots by the students. It was what we called in those years basic design. You could turn a plan like this upside down or right side up or on its ear, and it still maintained its kind of integrity. My problem with that is that, again, we lose the relationship to public and private and foreground and background and garden and entry and so on, and therefore the whole enterprise becomes a bit mushy for me. Now, these are two city halls. Again, they are not built 100 years apart. They are built in about the same year, 1919. The one on the left is in Portland, Oregon. The one on the right, unbuilt, is in Russia. And I show them to you, and I think it's a reasonable comparison because they appear to be about the same size, don't they? The one on the left is 3 stories in the center here and attaches to a 4-story wing back there. This is not exactly a porte cochere, but a porch here on the back side of, or the downside of the Portland City Hall. This is the mayor's office, as you might imagine. On the front side, the other side of the rotunda, is the city council chamber, and then this is the rest of the administration. Again, not a very difficult language, gets some of its message here as the rustication of the ground here as against the upper floors, starts to describe this building in a setting and in a kind of structural mode as well that is very different than perhaps the abstraction or the lightness felt in the building to the right. I take it it's about the same size, 1 floor, 2 floors, maybe 3, maybe 3.5. But again, the abstraction of the one on the right is working, I think, at odds with our understanding of ourselves, our place, our movement, our necessity to understand the symbols of our cities. In the 20th century, of course, abstraction has played an enormous role for all of us, a very positive role, because abstraction allows us, in terms of ambiguity, to say more than one thing. It allows us to be many actors in this play and in a way, enjoy the same places. However, it seems to me when one is overtly abstract or overly abstract to the point where I'm no longer allowed into the language and the language becomes private and therefore for me elitist, it is a difficult proposition. And it's that curious and rather fine line between what is figurative on one hand and what is abstract on the other in our time that I think interests many of us. Now, I looked before coming here tonight for a slide of the Crystal Palace in Paris and didn't have one. So let the orangerie on the left stand for the Crystal Palace, if you will. Much smaller, but just as interesting, it seems. And we think about abstraction, and we think about technology, and we think about our century as different from that of others that I've shown you tonight. And you imagine that in a curious way, the Crystal Palace is used quite often as a model for many of our glass houses today, whether they're modern office buildings in Los Angeles or whether they're the Beaubourg in Paris. And it is within that sense of abstraction and the kind of enormous void that can be built by our time that we become very encouraged about what technology can do for us. But what we tend to forget is that what Paxton tried to do in making his great glass house, and he did call it, of course, the Crystal Palace, is to first build a palace. And he built a palace based on the same kind of language that we might have seen, or we did see, in the Villa Madama. But the language of movement and privacy and frontal access, etc., disappears when the abstraction overtakes that sense of our own physical presence within the place. So that when we see a picture on the right, such as Beaubourg, here we are delighted and encouraged and interested, perhaps, or many of you are, in the sheer abstract delight of those colors, etc. I'm not, but maybe many of you are. That's not to speak down to it. I find it a design, not speaking even just about this building, but that idea as a design and not architecture, because for me architecture is based in theme, it's based in landscape, it's based in us, and it's based in technique. But when we today can instead of as we did 100 years ago, lift one brick on top of another or one piece of stone on top of another, and therefore very subtly be able to describe the size of a wall and ourselves relative to that wall as we would open the wall for doors and windows and so on, because the wall, of course, was partly structure. Today, we can lift the whole wall into place at one time. We tend to, again, subtly lose that humanistic description within the body of our architecture. On the left is a house in a street in London called Belsize Park Road, as is the one on the right. The street is made primarily of examples like the one on the left, all of about 150 years ago. But in the Second World War, 5 or 6 of these houses disappeared tragically one night, and after the war, these curious buildings were built in their place, or in the place of those that had been destroyed. Now, again, in perhaps a different setting than we've had before, again, you've been invited to tea, and I suppose it is proper here in London, and you quickly alight these steps, arrive at the front door. There is no doubt about that. There is a bay window on the side here. That bay window is presumably there to catch the morning and afternoon light as it faces on its sides east and west. It borrows a little bit of room or space from the street as it reaches beyond the boundary of the house. You've all been in houses like this into the front door. You know that if you hang a quick right there, you will come to the sitting room, and probably on the axis of your entry will be the fireplace. Turning left within that room, you will probably find the dining room. And then behind the stair, which is surely behind that front door, leading up to the bedrooms and the privacy up above, will be the kitchen. Beyond the kitchen is the garden, shared by all of these row houses in Belsize Park. It's not mysterious, but it is rather interesting in the few symbols that are used there of support, of enclosure, of entry, of the apertures made for windows and doors in that wall. Now, what makes this so poignant and curious is that this building here on the right is built exactly across the street from this house. And I imagined going to tea here. You wouldn't go to tea here. You go to lunch here, right? And I suspect that this house is a very bad mockery of the yaoul houses of Le Corbusier. If that's not a reach, I think it's probably not a reach to say that, because there was a whole ethic in the early brutalist years in London and other places of this kind of architecture. However, we've at least brought the door down to street level. We no longer have these nasty steps any longer. But we see that the walk takes us directly to the door jamb here, right? Now, remember, at this time, Walter Gropius was telling us that symmetry and axis were immoral. Now, he got away with it, obviously, with this architect. So we take a sort of half step to the left to encounter a door made of what you all know as T111. The mailman has no problem. But I would have a problem finding the knocker or the hinge or knowing where the doorbell is or the handle, because you see it's now all hidden. And we'll see another example of that in a moment. And there's the window that presumably matches that window. I suppose that's a tiny little window for the kitchen, so Mum can watch the child out here in this front park. And then, curiously, the abstractions subtly continue up the house here. And there is this Schlatnik that goes from top to bottom that we don't really notice because they invented something called a spandrel here between the windows. And that's to get the kind of division between house A and house B, or number 10 and number 12 over here. And again, we're so conditioned that we don't see these curious things and don't realize that we're really not 20 or 30 feet tall, as remembering the Kersting painting and trying to imagine ourselves behind one of these. Well, that's probably in a stair hall or landings or whatever, or a series of bathrooms. I don't know, something about privacy and small windows. But there's the phone. But what I like most about all of this is the comparison of this little porch to that one. These are clearly the smallest columns in all of Christendom, supporting a piece of metal, which in turn supports probably some gravel. I've never really understood that, but there's the drain coming out. How handy. And spilling onto the terrace below. Poor kids. I don't know. Now, maybe all of this isn't necessary, but it certainly makes me feel good as it's pouring down rain. Now, the last two of this, I just want to compare two other doors. Again, a little more than 100 years apart, but two examples that you probably know. The one on the left, which I think I've shown in every lecture I've ever given for 35 years. But the slide is of Pavilion number 9 at the University of Virginia. And the one on the right is not. It's in fact the American Airlines Pavilion that I went through to get here tonight. So that's what I got to do. And this is what friends of mine get to do, is go through those portals every day. But look at Jefferson and Latrobe at the University of Virginia here for just a minute. If you're walking quickly to class, you would live next door to the professor who lives here. He actually lives up there. Inside there is a big table with a dozen chairs around it where you will be taught during the day, and you will stay in there all day long. He or she will live up here. I guess it was he because it was a male institution up until quite recently. And if we were scurrying to class, we would come here, we would alight those steps, we would find the door. If this weren't such a dark slide or the lights were not on, you would see a rail across the door, a rail around the door. That's to keep the door light while keeping it stable, while the panels in between, again, contribute to the lightness. The rails give you a place to put the hinges and the knocker and all of that good stuff. All of those are subtle, prosaic little devices that we have in time symbolized. If we were coming across the lawn, we would come this way, be framed by these two columns here, and then secondarily, two more columns there up on the plinth, and then into the door. And that little tetrastyle here of 4 columns, as we're coming along here, makes a little place that's different than the rest of the colonnade. But what I like about it so much is Jefferson and Latrobe's interest in making 2 doors, not just one. They've made this second place here, which is the symbolic door for Pavilion number 9, the door that makes it a little bit larger than life, our life size at least, and contributes to our understanding of the place of that door in the whole series of 10 doors of its sort on the campus, as they are distinct from the students' doors on either side. Now, this isn't really a social distinction, but an academic one. But as we look across the lawn or approach it, we see the concavity of the wall and this excision taken into the brick wall by this white wood, I suppose standing for travertine or purity or some such thing that the colonial architects didn't have, the real stuff, so they painted it on, that Neoplatonic attitude toward their environment. And you could imagine on a sunny day how that light would spill down over the soffit here and into the porch. And what I find quite wonderful about it as well is that Jefferson does not give up the sense of protection in the most pragmatic sense. The soffit here is coplanar with the brick wall, and therefore we can walk from here to the plinth or to the door without ever getting wet if it's raining. simply because he has made these two surfaces join at that back face, and yet excised from that, as I say, is this great shaft of light that allows us to see the symbol of that particular professor as larger than others on that campus. On the right-hand side, a modern door, surely, and clearly we wouldn't have had this door if we hadn't had Poissy, and if we hadn't had the brick villa, and we hadn't had the polemic of the literal attitude to the landscape and how good it was to make our sitting rooms and our places join literally with our gardens. The architect of the Newark Airport wasn't quite as bright as Mies and Le Corbusier, of course. And so what he's done is given us not just a glass door and glass, I suppose you'd call these windows on either side, but he's given us bronze glass and aluminum bronze doors or frames here so that they will reflect the garden. Of course, the garden is in fact the Newark Airport parking lot out here. The door has been slimmed down to the point where there are no hinges anymore. Well, actually the hinge is down here in the snow because he has to keep this rail thin because he actually wants no wall here at all. And so this is a way of reflecting the wall and making it as small as he can in something you all know as a coignure section. I wish you well. There is no knocker and there is no handle. Of course, these doors are mechanical. And here is the lock for the door, again, down handy, done in the snow again. The problem, I suppose, is that after the architect has finished this jewel piece as one of the three great ports into the city of New York by air, the building inspector of Newark, New Jersey, and you can imagine how bright he is, comes to the site for the final inspection and says, Mr. Architect, we've had some complaints from people using your airport. They've been walking into your reflective glass doors. So I am going to require you to put idiot flowers on your doors here. And so the architect complies. You know that this whole now tradition has become much more interesting as big corporations now write IBM, IBM, IBM across their doors because, of course, the rail that Jefferson used would interrupt the view of the reflected parking lot there. But that's not enough. That might go unnoticed as well, so he's required that the architect has to write on here, do not push, and if you miss those two, then one last one so you don't break your face. So it's a curious time we lived in. Now, let's do these very quickly. I'm going to show you a series of projects that we have either just completed or recently completed and some that we're working on now. This is a small museum for Emory University in Atlanta. There are at least 2 museums in Atlanta. This one is an inside job, however, and this building was built in 1915 by a wonderful Pittsburgh architect by the name of Henry Hornbostel. Speaking of schools of architecture, if you ever get a chance to go to Pittsburgh and see Carnegie Mellon, see Hornbostel's School of Architecture there, because it is probably the best building for architecture, school of architecture that I know of in this country. It's not necessarily the best school of architecture, however. But this is the back side of Hornbostel's building. Again, that big opening here travels through the entire building. They ask us to make the left side into a museum and the right side renovated into offices for art and archaeology and anthropology. The marble, Georgia marble, used here are the shards of marble. This was not a rich university at that time, and so this wonderfully picturesque wall was made by the leavings of whiter buildings that were then being built in Atlanta. The tradition seems to continue. Here are the plans. This is when I feel very old-fashioned talking to you, but here is Hornbostel's front door. In you go, and that's Hornbostel's stair, and then our renovation of this side. I won't show you that side. There's simply faculty offices and classrooms and a little meeting room there. But what we tried to do was make two buildings in one, a big door here and one there, so there are secondary facades inside. Then into the permanent collection and their strongest collection, which is their Egyptian work. And then a series of smaller galleries over here, which are permanent as well. One's pre-Columbian, one's Greek, and so on. And then up the stair, which was required there, and into temporary galleries for drawings and for a variety of exhibitions not predicted at that time. In other words, the so-called flexible gallery here and then the more fixed ones down below. And there's the entrance to the galleries there on the left, and the only place we were allowed to go outside was to build a new fire stair here. And we took that opportunity to get to the fire stair to build a little bump on the back, the side of the building where new acquisitions would be shown. The permanent and Egyptian collection is here in that big room that I showed you. Painted on the floor is by kids in my office, the plan of Ramses II, so that the students at Emory University would know the scale of the endeavor where these guys were sleeping here. And then the vitrines behind, the stair moving up behind these vitrines that you see there. That isn't real skylight, but it's what we've called a lay light in the room. These were required, I hate them, but nevertheless, the room is quite lit enough with the lay lights in the room. In the Greek room, we have a plan of the Parthenon and Rectium and so on. And then the vitrine, again, close up on the right. In the recent acquisition room here on the left and under the stairs, we are able to kind of light the more precious elements of the collection in a darker space, then highlighting the bronzes, the golds, and the terracottas and smaller artifacts that they show. We are currently starting construction now just a month into the ground in a small office building in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. This is the river in Johnstown. There's a little Richardsonian church here, a little Gothic-y kind of church there, not quite Gothic, and a lot of bad spec office buildings and modern stuff around these two sides in Johnstown. There is a public square, which is here, and an enormous parking garage over there. This is for a corporation called Crown American, who builds shopping centers and owns small retail stores in the Midwest. So the people parking will arrive here into lobby, and then there's a porte cochere over there for undercover drop-off, and people coming from the square up above in this corner site. The building, as seen in the model here, is of Casota stone at the top, and the base 2 stories of agate granite, red agate granite, more or less as you see here on the right. This was the first model. They didn't like the top, asked me to change it, said it would be too expensive. Later found out they didn't like it. So there's the new top, which they seem to like, also Crown American. The president will sit in here, surveying all. The next project is an office and sales or auction space for Sotheby's, 72nd in York and Upper East Side of Manhattan. And then on top of Sotheby's, which is this base building here, pre-existing base building there, a 27-story tower for residential tower. Now Sotheby's has 3 stories here. Was formerly a P. Lorillard tobacco factory, renovated a few years ago for Sotheby's when they moved to 72nd Street. We're adding a floor to that and then the housing above it. But this project has been ongoing for 3 or 4 years in my office, and we just completed this model, and the client had asked us to make apartments that would be of the scale and variety that one would have found on Park Avenue in 1910. And I said I'll trade my fee for one of them. And I should have the plans, but it's too tedious, I suppose. They were really quite generous and wonderful, but the next day the oil crisis hit us. And so the building got much slimmer and taller as there were no more minor sheiks to take these apartments. And so this becomes Sotheby's in the new plan. This is the apartment tower overhead, and then I'll explain this in-between building, which is here. I tried to think about this. You probably hear call this a mixed-use project. But the Sotheby's, of course, as an auction house selling and auctioning paintings and artifacts and furniture, I thought the furniture might be one of the things that the apartment house and the auction house might share. In fact, you could buy it down here and haul it upstairs. But I made a kind of big vitrine here, or a palazzo, depending on the reading of it, as the kind of size of buildings that I think ought to be at a place like 72nd in New York. And then behind it, the wall of housing, which splits at this point because the tower across the street is of that height, and the views above the tower to all the way to Central Park are quite magnificent, and back to the river on the east side are quite good as well. Looking back at the East River, which is just over here. And then for a moment one can think that even the decorative parts made by the brick pattern or tile pattern and the balconies could be taken as the wall of the interior of either the street or the houses within. And there's an attempt at the jump of scale here, or the abstraction of those two ideas superimposed on each other. We're working for a group of developers from Australia, from Sydney, Australia, also in Atlanta. As you all know, the United States is for sale now, and every time these people want to buy another piece of us, they sell off something probably about the size of this building in Sydney, and with it they buy a big chunk of Atlanta or other cities, as they can get it for half price. I was asked about a year ago to do a master plan for too many square feet, 6.5 million square feet here in Atlanta. This is Peachtree Street here. Richard Meyer's White Building is down here, and Philip Johnson has an enormous tower, it seems, up there just beyond our site. But all of this is a shopping arcade here, entered from the side, entered from the front, and entered from the end or back there, with two residential towers there and offices at either end. Along this axis, we're looking at that street here. We were first asked, and this is what we're doing now, is to build the headquarters for this company called Hooker Barnes, or was called Hooker Barnes. They've just changed it to L.J. Hooker, their headquarters right there, and then housing and offices here. So we're going to see the character of those buildings as seen along Peachtree here. This is the front door of the shopping arcade with the offices up above, their tower there, and then speculative office buildings and housing beyond. Then again, the front door of the arcade. This is the first model of Hooker Barnes' tower, L.J. Hooker's tower, here, which was to frame Johnson's building beyond, which has a party hat on it back there. As you drive down the street, you would then align our double towers with Johnson's building. But when the president saw it, he said, "I don't like Egyptian." So We then did the next one, and we've done 4 more since then. I don't have slides of them, but they're variations on that theme. The next project is in La Jolla for rather interesting people who are developing a piece of property on La Jolla Village Drive, which is here. Those of you who haven't been to La Jolla shouldn't be fooled by the name Drive. It's more like Route 1 from where I come from. But there is to be a new office building, a new Hyatt 400-room hotel here, and given that this is Southern California, a health club here, a man-made lake, which was specified by the city, and then presumably some restaurants out here to come later. The character of the place looks something like this, where the office building is divided into 3 parts, a horizontal configuration, a vertical one, and then that belvedere on the side, which will give the rather prosaic floors of a normal office a chance to have special meeting rooms, lunchrooms, and so on there, and a view of the ocean beyond. A shared room at the top for conferences, which can be rented by anybody in here, and then a chance for various renters or leasers to take pieces of either of these 2 buildings, with the third as an option in a variety of configurations. And then reading across the health club and the hotel. And there's the health club here with a little running track on top, and the 400-room hotel with a loggia in front for sitting under and a stair down to the pool just below it. Now, you should all close your eyes for a minute. I have to get you to promise something. I was reminded by Michael Rotondi tonight that I have a contract with a client here in Southern California, which says that I cannot show this building or any of the buildings that I'm doing for them publicly. But I got the president of the company to say that I could show them academically. So all of you at this moment are academics, and if none of you here are from that company, I may have this job tomorrow, but you can't mention a word of this outside these hallowed halls, please. I think it's all silly. But this is for a movie company in Burbank, California. Will go unmentioned, though it may be revealed. There were a number of buildings built on a 44-acre site by Walt Disney in 1944 for a company he was working for at that time. We have been asked to do, first a couple of years ago, a master plan for the rest of the site, but I don't know whether any of that will get built, but we are doing this corner as a corporate headquarters for his former company. This is the frontispiece here. As you drive in there, there is an underground parking garage which is now being built there. When that's completed, presumably we will start construction on this, which wraps around another building, I think built in the late 60s or early 70s, which we've also been asked to give a kind of new face to. But this is a low-lying office building, which I think might turn out to be pretty good in a space behind it. This there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 guys holding up the smallest one here. They're kind of dwarfatids. And the president had asked me to make him smile but not be jokey. The president of this company. So you will emerge from the parking garage in a pavilion there, walk along 2 pergolas, not at once, and then into the front door. His office was going to be in here, but now he likes one of these guys back there, and so he's changed his spots. There's the building from the street here and the side street over there. An enormous hospital on this side. A couple of pretty ugly churches over there built in the 50s. Out of Branch Bank, of course, and then bungalows around there. So we've got sort of every scale, huge hospital, little bungalows and stuff in between. And so this building tries to be like the original buildings along what's called Dopey Drive here, and not like that one, but to give a kind of interesting scale to this, as there's an interior court there, which I think will probably yield the best room I've ever made, and then a single loaded court there with balconies to look out to the garden. The next project is for the same client. This is in Orlando, Florida, near a theme park you may have read about. The project was originally a competition between two architects, and we were lucky to win. The idea was to develop 450 acres with 7 hotels and a kind of adult entertainment area called blank, blank, blank Island. There is a theme park over here and a new project being built here by that company and another film studio called the Studio Tour, and a monorail that will perhaps someday connect all of this together. Our hotels located here and here are the first 2, and I'm sure that we'll only get to do these 2, as some of the rest of you might get to do some of those in time. But this was one of the first drawings. It isn't actually the first drawing we did, but the idea here was, because this theme park relies very heavily on illusion, illusions of places like the Piazza San Marco, which should not be destroyed, which are slightly smaller than the real thing. But as you look across the tree line, we didn't want to see a kind of real building. So what the tree line does is it occurs here, and what occurs above the tree line is this green tiled, now stucco pyramid, call it Reed Mountain. And then below that, as you get closer to this hotel called the Dolphin, there are banana leaves painted on the facade, again to abstract it a tad and take it out of a kind of capital A architecture reality. Across the lake, which we're making here, actually we're making the grass. The lake's, it's all a bog, so it's kind of reclaiming the grass. So the lakes are easier than the firm stuff around it. But this is called the Swan, which is here, and it has these same piers that the Dolphin has moving into the water. These are enormous hotels. This one is 1,500 rooms. This one's 450 rooms. And I've joked with the president of this company that if you order room service on Monday, you will get it on Thursday. But unless you have lots of children. Well, you probably won't go here because you have one out here as well. But anyway, we were trying to shorten the distance from the check-in desk to the furthest room. And so the configuration partly does that and gives us, at the same time, some interest out here on Swan Lake. This is the porte cochere, or the front door, for the Dolphin. Just read the Dolphin here. And then behind that, there's this enormous pyramid behind that, not drawn in my drawing here. But you enter from porte cochere out here in this section through a smaller colonnade, and then into the first foyer, which is lit from the top and has skylights along the side with a little rainforest on the side. And then into the lobby, which is 65 feet tall here, with a fountain in the center, not yet fully described. At this point, this is a kind of water game that these Dumbo characters play with one baby, or Dumbo himself, shooting his mother from the rear, and then mother thinking it's the father and shooting the father, and still trying to make the president of the company smile. But remember, this is a resort hotel, a convention and resort hotel, and so the themes are not terribly serious, and you have to find the way to get into the character of the place in Florida and of people enjoying themselves and their kids in this big place. The convention hall is the size of a kind of football field and a half, and these are panels that I've made for the walls. These will be vinyl panels which will be made in repeats of 3 along here, and then the wainscot along there. That's 35 feet high. And here the idea was, in a way, to destroy the scale of the wall and make it bigger than life, so that the outside would be trumped up to a much larger scale than you would think, so that you too would be large. Here is the floor pattern for the rugs that we're doing for the same hotel. Well, I was anxious to show you these. If those lights were out, you'd see a really wonderful indigo blue, I think wonderful, indigo blue on the left, for some new carpets that we're doing for a company in Germany called Vorwerk. And these are a series of carpets that we're working on for them. Oh, how pretty. Let me go back. See? I like it anyway. These are just roll carpets. I'm sure there'll be carpet squares someday. Sticking with artifacts for a moment, you don't really have to do that, do you? This is a cup for Tiffany's, and on the left, our first job for Tiffany, and which has been given now as a commemorative to the director of a museum in the East Coast for 25 years of service or something. But then on the right, this year's Christmas present, you just get yours while they're hot. Come on. The next project is a health club in Tokyo for Shiseido, the cosmetics firm. This is the aerobics room. Again, a ley light. There's a 30-story building above that light here. This was a building under construction, and they had let the architect go, and they hired us to build in the column spacing that had been set for the apartment tower up above, which we were able to do. Over here, in the same room, I'm sorry, just the wrong exposure, but it's the only slide I had. You find, as is true in lots of places in Tokyo, 3 helpers here and 1 participant. And he probably owns Sanyo or something, and you can see the perspiration just welling up on his back there. You've all been to aerobics, and you know the kind of heated music you get in this country, and especially here in Southern California. They were listening to a ballad by Ella Fitzgerald. It was wonderful. It was absolutely a waltz, and these girls were helping him stand up. They promised only 3 pieces of equipment in this room, and they have 23 pieces. So there's absolutely too much architecture in there. But these are their little cubby holes for their shoes and socks and so on before getting into the pool, which I'll show you. This is marvelous culture because as you enter, you are given your uniform, and you may not wear. Think of the people who would be out of business in this country, but you are given a gold or yellow and blue set of shorts and T-shirts and sneakers and socks, all washed and ironed for you for your next trip in, and everybody looks the same. And here's the pool. Again, the ceiling span was set for us already. It wasn't so bad, except there is this one skylight over here traveling the length of the pool, which then gave us a way of lighting this tile wall. Some of you in the audience will know the wonderful pool house of an architect in London with the unlikely name of Halsey Ricardo. But he had built a wonderful tile manor house, and behind it a pool house, which I'd never seen in real life, only from, not inside, but only from the outside. But looking through the windows, I had seen blue and white tiles which came to life when people were splashing around in the pool because of all the reflections. So there was this wonderful life to the wall. But given that this was not my photography, they had to wait till all the people were out of the pool before they would take the picture. So I'm sorry I can't show you that these walls are an utter success. The next project is a little museum in Youngstown, Ohio. Youngstown is a curious and wonderful place where Stanford White built a museum years ago, and then the town founded around a series of a dozen of these steel mills settled by Middle Europeans at the turn of the century. Has fallen into a different kind of economy altogether, as all of the steel mills are now dead and gone, and all of that's being made in Japan. So we are ordering the steel for our museum from Japan to bring it back to Youngstown, Ohio, where it originally was made to commemorate its leaving. The city fathers and mothers of Youngstown know, of course, that the State University is up here, the town is down there. The old rail yard that hauled the goods back and forth to the steel mills was in here, that sliced the town in half, will now become a kind of cultural belt. And our building will be the first built to try to connect upper to lower. And this is a little building simply to commemorate industry and labor in that valley. And then adjacent to that, the city has now asked us to make a park at the time when the museum is closed and you don't walk through the museum, and on a Sunday afternoon you can walk through the park to make the same connection. So we're going to move around this building and see not only its plan and section, but its attitude toward all this. You can imagine that it's, I thought at least, a kind of folly to try to imitate this. Obviously, and some of you have already thought, sitting where you are, why not simply remodel one of these? Well, they are inappropriate in that they weren't built for museums. They are rusting away, and in the end, this museum would occupy a little corner of one of these tin buildings here. All of this is open to the weather, of course. And though the wonderful Damuth kind of landscapes are alive and well, they get more picturesque every day as they seem to rust and crumble into the ground. Across the street, we have the unlikely partner of the city cathedral, which is called St. Columba, made of Kasota stone from Minnesota. And so we have one to commemorate the labor and industry of Youngstown in that valley, and on the other hand, contextual requirement of the city and a normal situation of being a kind of good neighbor to the cathedral across the street. So our building has a rather demure face on the entry side where the auto court is. The big yellow school bus will arrive here, dropping the kids off, and they come in to the museum at that point. And it takes its clue from the idea of the 19th century mill, where we were still the primary interest of labor, not the thing made. So the buildings still look like buildings, still look like architecture, even though they did what they were meant to do, as these big barns were opened up inside, as you might imagine. The plan looks like this from the ground floor. One enters into one of two classrooms for a 20-minute movie or lecture, pays one's fare here, temporary gallery there, in to the permanent collection there, and then downstairs more of the same artifacts around here shown in special galleries, or up the stair to the reading room and card catalog room there on the north side. with stacks and archives of labor and industry in the state of Ohio. The park side is seen here with a kind of answer to our stair, our steel stair over there. There is the section, rather simple. One enters that upper level in, down, and can even visit the storage there, back up again and out. Or at the lower level, leave and go out to the park or down to town or up the hill here. Then a series of buildings that were required for, as I said before, their special collections. They have models, scale models, steel models that actually make steel for you while you're watching it. The stair tower on that side. The kind of wonderfully articulate but curious barnacles that were placed on the side of these mills for a variety of rather ephemeral events that could come and go are seen in that kind of idea on the back side of the building. There is some movement in town to get the railroad put back where it was here underneath the legs of our little barnacle as a symbol of what was. The next project is like a big house, but for a university. This is Alumni House at West Virginia University, or the University of West Virginia, where the site is rather steeply sloped, low side here, high side there. We are looking from this drive there into the door where one parks over here and looks across at the domestic setting of the rest of Morgantown, West Virginia. The stadium is up here in this corner. What these people are doing is coming back on Saturday afternoon to watch the Mountaineers play football and to give piles of dough at lunchtime in that big dining room. So this becomes a kind of university house for the alumni. And we have made a plinth here for their Mountaineer to be placed there on the chimney stack once it's donated. Inside, we weren't allowed to do the interiors, so that's not me. Even the colors aren't me. But a local student was asked to do them. They thought they needed to give something away to somebody close at hand. But that's me. So that's just the big dining hall with one coming in here, looking over the dining hall. All the football trophies are there, down the stair and into the hall. The building day and night. About, I don't know, $35, $40 a square foot. Drive it. This is a project that we're working on now, a little house on the Hudson for a wonderful couple living in New York. She's a painter. He's some sort of computer whiz and likes to look at the stars. But the Hudson is out here, down the hill, obviously. Those of you who know the site. This is Rhinebeck, New York, a suburb of the city. A vestibule here, a stair down to children's rooms. This porch is here, a later addition with her studio below, an eat-in kitchen over there on that side with the MBR up at the top. This is the front face of the building, rather closed. This is the back face of the building, with a little more open. The later scheme is even more open. I never seem to have big enough windows for my clients. This is the kitchen half and the eating half here, with the water coming off the roof there through the chimney and over the terrace and down into a little pool here where goldfish were required. It's marvelous. Goldfish can manage in the wintertime. I didn't know that. They seem to sort of semi-hibernate. I didn't know that. This is the winery in the Napa Valley near Calistoga, which was a competition which we were lucky to win. The project has changed a bit in the following manner. This storage here is now in the hill back there, which was a good move, I thought, and a lot less expensive. The building became rather controversial, not because of the architecture so much, but because of what the client wanted to build that wasn't strictly for the making of wine. And that was a big tasting room here outdoor, and a terrace there for his surrealist sculpture over on that side, a walkway up to a little nymphaeum there, and then a walk back down, amphitheater over there, and then a walk back down to the tasting on that side. This winery is called Clos Pegasus, named after Pegasus, the mythic horse that stomped on the top of the mountain to bring the waters up from the earth and then irrigate all of this vineyard below. And so all of that water rushing from the top of the hill down here had a kind of thematic source. And we were also asked to work with a painter or an artist, a sculptor, which we did with Ted Schmidt, a wonderful figurative painter from New York. And Ted was to paint the insides of these buildings that won't get built. So he's out of luck. But the neighbors, well, one neighbor here, Mrs. Stefanelli, right up there, who has a small winery, didn't want the competition, so she said, none of this stuff, folks. And so she has won, which may be, in the end, good for the valley. But this is the highway out here, 29, then a road in that separates our vineyard from the Sterling vineyard over here. This is the working court, and this is the visitor court, so we'll see that real quick. This is the building from the highway, and the program asked to see the building from that road as the face should, and all the competitors did this, described the building more or less as that was the good light too, from the main highway. Then ours had the visitor court here and the working court there. And there was the tasting and the making of the wine there. There's that terrace for the surrealist sculpture, which I didn't like very much, so I didn't put any of it in the model. And then the house for the vintner up at the top of the hill. There's the working court in the model. If you were a grape, you would come in here, get dropped off there, taken inside that big shed, and stomped to death by maidens in great wooden vats. If you were a visitor, you would come either through this barley or rye. You'd probably come by car and park here, and then be confronted by a column in the middle of the door where it doesn't belong, which is intended to separate the left side, the tasting and dining room side, from the administration and the making side over here, and also act as a support for another piece of sculpture by Ted Schmidt, which, as you see, has not been built. Did he say next? Okay. So easily intimidated. This is the big room that helps that separation, that actually takes you on back to the garden behind, and something called the wood cast storage room, which I'll show you. There's the wood cast storage room, which obviously we didn't have much to do with, but it's probably the prettiest room in the place, with a great oak tree in front. Our door is on the axis of the oak tree. That's now a rather nice garden in front of that. And then up the hill, just barely make out the dining court of the vintner's house on the top. Well, here's the garden, better developed, I guess. There's the oak back to the front door. The side of the manufacturing piece over here, big shed. The last picture that I'll ever take of the house is seen here under construction, as they are quietly remodeling the inside and painting it white. They have turned the rather Tuscan forecourt into a Japanese garden now, and they have made rather wonderful pots for the top of these little columns there, which we had done in copper. They have done in terracotta, which are quite dreadful. But we have this is the only time this has, I think, happened to me in 25 years of practice. We have completely lost control. Well, you may think from this picture we had, but at this point, we thought we still had control at this point. This is appearing to be black. It's actually dark green, and I'm told by res it will go to that color in a couple of years. So that's the point. That's clearly too dark at this point. Okay, we're almost finished. We were asked just a short 6.5 years ago to build an addition equal to in size and a little larger to the Whitney Museum of American Art on Madison Avenue in New York, 74th, 75th Street, 74th, 75th Street here. And Breuer's building finished in 1966, as you see it there in this slide. The Whitney Museum bought a hole in the ground. A developer had decided not to go ahead with that building. They had torn down some brownstones that looked like this in the 60s to build, I think, an apartment block. The Whitney bought that site, and therein lies the story of that particular site, which is here. Breuer built, as you see, 2 concrete walls, one there and one there, which you can see in the slide. This is the east side, and this is the southern side of the site. Breuer built these concrete walls, so obviously his object building would be read as a thing, as an object relative to itself rather than the context. And in fact, at that time, he was quoted as saying that he wanted to keep the rather mediocre context out of one's understanding of his building. If he thought that today, he probably either wouldn't have been chosen for the job or would have been smart enough not to say it. We were given this task of building in this part that I pocheted light terracotta there at the end of the block, which is exactly 100 feet from the concrete wall of Breuer's to the edge of the site. Most New York blocks, the normal ones are 200 by 800, and here's Breuer at 100 feet, and where are the other 100 feet. One other thing I should tell you about the Breuer building is that as you see it stepped back here, and if you think that our addition should be, those of you who already don't like it, should simply be a continuation of this extruded section there, that wouldn't be allowed today. What you need to know is that there is now a street wall requirement that buildings have to come to the ground. I thought they'd never ask, but they have to come to the ground here, as the street must be maintained here in the Upper East Side Historic District of New York. Now, all of these buildings in New York, in the Upper Side Historic District, are landmarked. It doesn't matter whether they are good buildings or bad buildings, they are all landmarked because it's the district that is being preserved. Okay? Now, our site, here's 74th and 75th. You can take this as a plan or elevation. It works both ways. But our site is a diptych, clearly divided exactly in the middle here. Here are the brownstones in our mass model. Here is the Breuer building, with, I might add, a floor that most of you don't know exists on the top, which is the 6th floor, mechanical and some other stuff up there, and a little terrace around here, the director's office, and so on. And then this slot that separates the stair from, well, it allows the stair to separate the building from the brownstones adjacent. But any of the painters in the audience know that that composition, the diptych composition, putting so much pressure on the kind of center line here is a very difficult kind of figure to resolve. In an enunciation, that is a pretty easy thing and a fortuitous thing because obviously you can get the two figures, the Archangel and the Virgin Mary, to confront each other around a column or a space or whatever in the diptych. But here it's a different story. Now, in New York, there is a law that would allow us to build a bulk of this size on that site. That is the FAR, the floor area ratio requirement, would allow us that bulk on that side. Don't worry, we're not going to do that. At the same time, that mass would then be tempered by another law, which is the sky exposure plane law, which would result in a building looking like that. Now, there were 2 or 3 requirements given to me by the trustees of the Whitney. One was to keep the front door where it was in the Whitney. 2 was to build one institution, not Breuer's building and our building, or old and new, or modern and not, but to build one institution. And the 3rd requirement was to build horizontal gallery space. So what we did was to turn that sky exposure plane diagram over on its side, which resulted in a mass that looked like that over the top of the 2 buildings. Now, Breuer's building is here, intact. Our building is there. The brownstones that were once there are remembered here, at least in scale. The shop fronts, which all of those brownstones now have, are put back as the city, again, asks that the character of the street be maintained, and that clearly is a good thing. So those will be rented out. That also help the Whitney. And then above the brownstone scale here, which fortuitously is at the height of the first setback of Breuer's building. Breuer's building is about 100 feet. It's 96, and so is ours. 100 feet is the requirement. We will actually have to get, if this building is ever built, a waiver to build a building a little lower on the site, on the street face. Breuer's north-facing window here will be echoed over there on our 4th floor, which is our only double-height space for a sculpture gallery, with alabaster window here letting ambient light into that sculpture floor. Then in between, to take care of the diptych problem, I thought our building and Breuer's building will then focus in part on this cylinder, which will have all the special events of the Whitney, the access to the auditorium, the orientation gallery, which talks about Mrs. Whitney and her collection, the Calder Circus, and other special events up through the building. And it would be the first time, if this building were built, that as, for instance, let's say, as Julian Schnabel is there now, that you could look at the permanent collection here. And our building is about the permanent collection of the Whitney, which they don't show now. But to be able to compare today's art with the history of American art as it occurs on the other side. And then one more gallery here, and then a library and mechanical system up above. Offices and mechanical, and libraries, pardon me. I won't show you all the plans, but I'll show you the first floor. There's Breuer's stair. Like Mrs. Huxtable's remark on my early training, it was said that I was taking Breuer's stair out. All I was doing was taking Breuer's concrete wall out, as I would never have thought that the Landmarks Commission would want the concrete wall, which kept the context at bay, to remain. How wrong I was. Here is the stair. You can look out. There are 2 landings that look out to a kind of modern pissoir here on Madison Avenue, where that's just a place for people to hang out. And then there are 11 landings and above that, which are dark, are black. There are no windows. So don't be fooled by, that's what most of them look like right there. But my detractors, wonderful architects like I.M. Pei and Ed Barnes and people like that, say Graves is taking the stair away, et cetera, et cetera. But like Mrs. Huxtable, they've got me believing it. The entrance remains the same. The elevators are here. They used to be in the first scheme back there, but made a very high wall on the residential side. The highest wall was on the side least able to accept it, and we have now, because that made such a high wall, and the reason we did that was to keep the horizontal space on the upper floors flowing back and forth, unencumbered by that elevator. We have nevertheless now made a different kind of plan here, where Breuer's plan is here intact. and our plan over here. Now, the work that we show in the permanent collection is clearly a lot smaller in scale than things like the Schnabel that are being, Schnabels that are being shown there now. The building from the side is seen here. That's that 100-foot mark, and that's the addition to the top. This is Madison Avenue. Those of you who are not familiar with New York zoning, the avenues, which run north-south, get a scale not unlike what you see here with incidents like the Carlisle Hotel, which is a wonderful building here with a kind of deco tower poking up above that, and then Park Avenue is over here, same scale as Madison, and then in between the streets going east-west are a much smaller scale. The scale, in fact, of our kind of surrogate brownstones on the side of the commercial part of the Whitney, as you see it. And then the building as if it were finished. From the north looking south, Breuer's building, intact. Then from the south looking north, our building, and that's the amount that you would see up above. A lot to complain about, folks, here and there. Well, the end of this story is that we have recently presented, again, this is probably something that is not public yet, but will be within hours. Not because of you, but because of meetings in New York, that we will probably withdraw from the consideration of the Landmark Preservation Commission at this time. The writing seems to be on the wall that the tearing down of the brownstones, that battle has not been won, and that's a separate battle, and we have to find another way called the Hardship Clause to not set a precedent in the city of New York. And it was also determined, or it appears that the writing is on the wall, that the hinge, this piece that mediates between the southern half and the northern half and tries to make one institution, will not be built either. So the idea that we can make one institution is becoming a little bit more difficult. I didn't want to make another gray-black building. As you see, the street is not that. It's limestone, it's white brick, it's red brick, and it's red sandstone. And especially around the corner of all of these streets where the brownstones occur, the red or brown sandstone is prevalent. So our building takes its clue from Breuer's building, trying to be the same value as Breuer's building, but then of the color or of the context, and trying to not mock Breuer, but be of the same color value, but not the same color. So we'll probably do scheme 3 if they ask me again. They may ask one of you, I don't know, as it's getting old. The last, very quickly, the Humana building here in Louisville, Kentucky. Fifth Street is here, Main Street is there, and just 1 block away is the Ohio River. This again was a competition which we were lucky to win, with 3 new buildings around our site. One over here, which you see there, which is a performing arts hall just finished a couple of years ago. A little bank by the successors to Mies van der Rohe over there, his office. And then a 40-story black steel and glass office building, bank building, big bank building called, in our office, the BFB. This is a very big building. And required by the terms of the program of the competition is that we had to do something all 3 of these wonders did, and that is to make a public plaza. This one obviously did it first so that it could be taller and more visible in city, and gave away that much ground, which of course is never used. This pavilion, thinking back to the brick house now, sits alone on its own lawn, never used. This one has a kind of gash out of it. The door, as you might guess, is over here in the crotch, right there. Terrible, terrible building. And so a couple of the competitors didn't like that idea. So I, for one, and I think Caesar Pelli and the other, drew our required plazas back into the body of the building, still outside, but trying to keep the street front here, because what you may not have noticed is the rest of the street is really quite marvelous, mostly late 19th century, early 20th century storefronts, as you see here in that etching there on the side. Those are those buildings there. Now, what we tried to do in a 27-story building, one, our context is not just these wonderful little guys over here, but the BFB over there as well. So we tried to do a building that would adhere to this scale at the height of a loggia, and then be porous above that where the roof terraces of the executive offices occur, and then above that set the office tower back on line with the BFB, which is back here and set back from the street. So that, seen from this side at least, our building finally gives the BFB a kind of profile, which this building is now called the box the Humana building came in town. The difference between that model and this drawing is about 6 months, and it had switched from Casota stone to granite, which was a specification of the client, Humana company, which is a hospital company if you don't know them. The front door here, the loggia there, continuous along the street, and the side, a public porch for anybody in Louisville to enjoy the view of the river, and for all of these folks to have lunch out there on good days. On not so good days, there is a sunroom or at least a lunchroom for every floor here on the backside, which superimposes a second tower within the standard offices just beyond. Again, we didn't get to do the interiors of this building, just the public spaces, and this wasn't seen as a public space, so one of you did this, and well, not really, but I did the shutters. And you look at it, more BFBs out there, done by offices with 3 letters, starting with S. There's the BFB having a new base finally on the back side, and there are sunrooms up to these rooms up the back side of the building. The south side of the building, our building faces north to Main Street and the Ohio, yet the good light is here facing the rest of town, so it has this double face, and that's the interest in doing this back side. And then the Falls of the Ohio, where Louisville was founded, just outside, just on the Ohio, just at the edge of our building here, and that's what that looks like. So our entry, our loggia, our public plaza, gets this big fountain which looks back at the falls, giving it some reciprocity now, it seems, and the door between this 60-foot fountain on either side. It's now where people meet in Louisville. There's the side coming from the parking garage and then into the side or into the front door there. The building in context backwards, sorry, on the left, where these folks are up in this 19th century etching here. They're actually up on a Corinthian water tower in town, which again looks out to the Ohio, and I thought, having been taken there during the visit of all the architects to the site, I thought what a marvelous thing it would be to get to see the river and, of course, the state of Indiana just across the river. And so that porch is what that's about, and then the steel structure below that, not unlike the steel bridges of the Ohio, supporting those ventures across the river as we are looking across the river for our porch. And there's the porch itself, looking across on a rather gloomy day to the Ohio and to Indiana. And the lobby on the left and the elevator lobby on the right. We were lucky here. We got to, in the public spaces, we got to design the light fixtures and all of that sort of thing as well, which is great. And it was wonderful getting to work for the Medicis here. And for once, me not having to paint it on, getting to use real stuff was great. This rotunda looks up to the second floor, which is all commercial on the second floor. You can enter shops from the outside or the inside of the lobby, so that makes that public as well. There's the building day and night. That's pink granite here from Finland. And the building at night. And I close with these two And I'm sorry, I'll apologize now for keeping you so long. But what are you going to do in Santa Monica on Wednesday night? Somebody said, Tom Main said to me tonight, I guess it started here for you, didn't it? And I said, you mean in Portland? And he said, yes. And in a way it did. Actually, it started years before that, but nobody knew. And that kept all the projects very small. I was known for 15 years as the Cubist Kitchen King. As I only built on the back of Victorian houses in Princeton. They never did let me out on the street. It was always in the backyard. But this actually isn't where it started. It started a year or two before this when we did a project that wasn't built in Fargo, North Dakota, but I pretended in all my lectures like it was about to happen. And I gave a lecture in Portland one night, and after the lecture had dinner, and the man sitting next to me said, your project in Fargo looks great. What could we do to get you to come out here and enter a competition to build our new city hall? And I said, ask. And so we were lucky to do this. This was a design-build competition in Portland in 1979-80. And I close with these two because thinking about the kind of the eclectic nature of the list of speakers and the kinds of things I've shown you tonight, which I trust is probably not the kind of thing that you draw during the day here at SCI-Arc. Nevertheless, I suppose there's room for all of us. At least I think so. I also think there's room for good, healthy, critical debate about architecture, and I think it should happen. It should happen in the academic circles that we're in tonight. It should also happen more actively in the professional circles. I have, as Michael said in the introduction, been the subject of controversy in this building and in a couple of other ones like the Whitney, and I find my skin gets thinner and thinner. I was never trained to get up in the morning and have all of those clippings on my desk and read them and have my day destroyed, but it does happen, and it's very hard to work given what one reads about oneself, and I'm silly enough to read it and still do, hoping that somebody will like something, but they don't often. But where criticism is one thing, and even the debate that occurs in the press, not quite criticism, but something else, nevertheless, it is written and it's legal and it's okay. I wish it were done in a more scholarly way, but I guess they want to make it simple and down and dirty. So they do, but it's getting, as many of you know who are confronted with the same problem, much more like gossip and much more like, you know, what we have in New York called the column of Susie. But here in Portland, where I first confronted real controversy, I had imagined that my site being between the existing City Hall, which you saw the other side of when we started this talk, and the county courthouse, which was there, both built in the first quarter of the century, which the city of Portland has outgrown. Clearly, with all these wonderful things around, the city has gotten much bigger, if not better. I thought that my context was something like these buildings with similar attitudes, though perhaps not similar forms, but similar attitudes to the way people worked and lived and entered buildings and so on. And I thought I had to stand, or got to stand in the midst of these other two guys. But that was very threatening to the local architects, people like Pietro Beluschi and SOM, who had an office in this building that they had designed here, and didn't make it to the finals of the competition. But there was a very strong movement in Portland at that time towards censorship. And censorship is quite different than criticism. And when I look at the work of Le Corbusier or Mies, as I have tonight, and others, to be able to debate architecture and talk about architecture to you or you to me, I think is one of the healthiest things that we share. Censorship is something else, and why I bring it up tonight is that's happening to me now on the Whitney Museum. I think it's quite fine for IMPE to write and to think about my building and other buildings and to suggest that they could be otherwise in the press or anywhere he wants, or Ed Barnes or any of the other ones, any of the other 600 architects in New York that have signed a petition against my building. But to petition that the building shouldn't be built, I think, is something else. I mean, one could think about recent extravagances of some of those architects and call the kettle black. Thinking back to Boston not too many years ago, and all of those wonderful glass shards on the street of the John Hancock building, and then knowing that Pei himself is a very frugal man, probably went to Boston with a basket, picked them up, and took them directly to Paris, where they were piled up in a pyramidal heap, where I've just come from, and you can't imagine how big it is. I was asked to sign a petition against that building. Little good it would have done, obviously. But I do think that another analogy one could use, I suppose, if you thought in terms of literature, and I did, this isn't about Chaucer or Shakespeare, but if you think about people writing today, or somebody like Norman Mailer, if he had just finished his latest novel, and you could imagine what Gore Vidal would think about it. But Gore Vidal probably wouldn't go to the publisher and say, he's a bad man, he's a bad novelist, don't publish it. He would probably go to the Times Literary Supplement and say, I'd like to review it. And it seems to me that's where we stand today, and that's, we stand at a moment when we have to somehow take criticism, seize criticism, and use it constructively in the university, in the schools of architecture, and in the press, and not censorship. And my final remark would be simply to the students that are here tonight: the things that I've shown you, those of you who might like what I have done or think that you might like to do something like that, I would caution you against it. I'm certainly not here tonight to show you things to take to your drafting boards tomorrow. But I am here to make a strong plea for all of us, I suppose, that dealing with what is figurative and what is abstract in architecture, and in one, not go too far, because we can see in some revisionist thinking that is going on today in London and in New York and other places, that classical architecture is being re-seen in a way that is simply quite trite, I think. And on the other hand, the abstractions and the excesses of abstraction by some architects, certainly architects building really bad office buildings in New York, take abstraction too far in the other direction, or architecture too far in the other direction. But it's that fine line in between that I think ultimately will help us find our front door. Thank you very much.
There's a reception in the graduate annex down the street.
Oh, thanks for
It
coming.
was really nice.
Good.
It was great.
Good.
I'm glad to hear that this